They said I was an acceptable loss, but the alien queen refused to leave me behind. I want to sit with that title for a second before we get into this. Acceptable loss. Two words that sound like they belong in a military briefing. Cold and clean and clinical. But when you actually think about what those words mean, that someone looked at you, at your life, at everything you are, and decided the math just didn't work out in your favor, that hits different. And the question I kept asking myself before I wrote this story was, what happens when the person they've already written off refuses to stay written off? Not because of some grand rescue plan, not because anyone came back for them, but because someone who had every reason to save herself chose not to walk away. That's what this story is about. And I promise you, by the time we get to the end, you're going to look at the word expendable completely differently. Now, let's get into it. The mission briefing called it a low-risk extraction with moderate environmental hazard. That was the official language. 14 words that were technically accurate in the same way that describing a wildfire as elevated ambient temperature is technically accurate. True enough to file. Not nearly honest enough to prepare anyone for what actually happened on the ground. The soldier's name in the records was Specialist Dren Voss, 26 years old, human, third-generation military from a family that had been sending people into uniform since before humanity had even made first contact. He was the kind of soldier who got assigned to joint operations not because command thought he was exceptional, but because he was considered reliable, steady, the kind of guy you put in the back of a formation where you need someone to hold position without asking too many questions. The briefing officer had used the word complementary when describing his role in the operation, which, if you've ever sat in a military briefing, you know is the polite way of saying that your job is to make the important people look better by comparison. Dren had heard some version of that his whole career. He didn't argue about it. He'd learned early that arguing about your perceived ceiling was a good way to make sure nobody ever raised it. So he showed up, did the work, and kept a running list in his head of every mission where the complimentary guy was the only reason anyone made it home. He called it his evidence file. He never showed it to anyone. The joint operation was a Sovereignti extraction, a coalition mission between humanity's outer systems force and the Sovereignti Empire, a civilization that spanned 9 star systems and had been in formal contact with Earth for 61 years. They were tall, bilateral, with pale blue-gray skin that caught light the way polished bone does, and a secondary pair of arms that folded tight against the torso when not in use. Their eyes were wide and amber, adapted for a homeworld with lower light levels, and they saw in frequencies humans needed equipment to detect. They were also, without question, the most strategically sophisticated military culture humanity had ever encountered. Every Sovereignti soldier trained for a minimum of 9 years before being cleared for field operations. Their command doctrine was built on something their military philosophers called the lattice, a decision-making framework so deeply embedded in their training that it was less a methodology than an instinct. Every move calculated, every variable accounted for, every cost weighed before it was paid. The lattice was why they won wars. It was also why they had rules about acceptable losses that were precise, documented, and completely without apology. If the math said you couldn't bring someone home without compromising the mission, you noted it in the operational log. You made sure someone filed the paperwork, and you moved. It wasn't cruelty, it was the lattice. The lattice had saved thousands of lives over centuries. The lattice was the reason the Sovereignti Empire still existed. Her name was Sovereignti Commander Asha Rel Sovath, but her soldiers, the ones who'd served with her long enough to stop being terrified of her, called her the architect, because she didn't just follow the lattice, she built with it. She was the kind of commanding officer who could look at a tactical situation that had already collapsed into chaos and find the geometry in it, the load-bearing points, the angles nobody else had seen, and restructure the whole thing in the time it took most people to figure out what had gone wrong. She had never, in 22 years of service, lost a mission. She had, according to her file, authorized 11 acceptable loss calls, 11 times where the lattice said the math didn't work, and she had signed the form that said someone wasn't coming home, and she had continued the mission, and she had been right, every single time. The mission had been preserved. The larger objective had been secured. The Sovereignty Empire was, in some small thread of causality, safer for each of those decisions. She did not lose sleep over them, not because she was heartless, but because the lattice wasn't built on feelings. It was built on outcomes, and the outcomes had proven her right. Dren Voss had read exactly none of this before being assigned to her detail. He'd been given a 3-page briefing document, a weapons loadout rated for the target planet's atmospheric conditions, and 30 minutes to get to the staging area. The briefing document described the architect as a high-value Sovereignty field commander, whose operational safety is the primary objective of this joint detail. It did not mention the lattice. It did not mention the 11 acceptable loss calls. It mentioned, on the last line of the last page, almost as an afterthought, that Specialist Voss was assigned to rear security and should consider his role supplementary to primary Sovereignty protective assets. He was, the briefing document implied without quite saying, there in case something routine needed doing. A warm body with a human flag patch, present for coalition optics, not the thing keeping anyone alive. He added it to the evidence file. The target world was called Orcs in the Sovereignty charts. It was a low-gravity rock about 40% the diameter of Earth, with a thin, breathable atmosphere that smelled like iron and old rain and sat just barely inside the survivable range for both human and Sovereignty physiology without full suits. Just barely. Which meant the mission planners had decided full suits weren't necessary, which was the kind of decision that sounds reasonable in a briefing room and feels very different 4 hours into a mission when the altitude headache has settled in behind your eyes like something with teeth. The extraction target was a signals array buried in a ridge formation 12 kilometers from the designated insertion point. The array had been quietly transmitting compressed data packets toward a relay station on the edge of Sovereignty-controlled space for approximately 8 months before anyone noticed. What it was transmitting, Dren didn't know and wasn't cleared to know. What he did know was that 3 separate intelligence agencies across 2 civilizations had decided retrieving the array physically was worth a joint operation on a border world that technically belonged to neither of them. He also knew, because he'd had 61 hours in transit to think about it, that worth a joint operation was coalition language for, this is important enough that if something goes wrong, both governments would prefer to share the blame. The insertion was clean. 12 soldiers total, 8 Sovereignty, 4 human, 2 of whom were signals specialists, and 2 of whom were security. Dren was the second of the security pair. The first was a Sovereignty soldier named Valath, 9 years trained, who had looked at Dren during the staging brief with the particular expression of someone trying to remember whether they'd been told anything useful about the other species, and coming up empty. Dren had given him a nod. Valath had returned it. They had established, in that exchange, a working relationship that was cordial, professional, and almost entirely absent of actual communication. The march to the ridge took 3 hours. The architect moved at the front of the column with the contained, deliberate energy of someone who had already walked every version of this terrain in her head, and was now simply confirming what she'd already concluded. She didn't talk much during the march. When she did speak, it was precise. Range, bearing, timeline adjustment. The kind of information that didn't invite response, just acknowledgement. Dren stayed at the rear. He watched the terrain. He logged the gaps in the ridgeline where crossfire would be bad. He noted the wind direction twice an hour, because on low-gravity worlds with thin atmospheres, wind direction affected trajectory in ways that the standard human field equations didn't fully account for, and he'd had to learn that the hard way on his second deployment, and he was not planning to learn it again. Nobody asked him what he was doing. That was fine. He wasn't doing it for an audience. They reached the array site an hour ahead of schedule, which the architect noted and immediately used to build in additional sweep time before extraction. The signals team went to work on the array housing. The security element fanned into position. Everything was going exactly as the briefing had said it would. And then the ridge moved. Not metaphorically. The ridge actually moved. A section of rock formation on the northern face of the extraction site that had registered on survey as a natural geological shelf turned out to be something else entirely. Something that had been waiting, patient and cold, and completely invisible to the pre-mission scans, for exactly this moment. The first detonation took out 2 of the Sovereignty soldiers before anyone had registered the sound. The second collapsed the primary egress route in a wall of displaced rock and thin atmosphere dust. The third, and this was the one that changed everything, hit the forward position where the architect had been standing when she called the schedule adjustment. Dren was already moving before the dust from the third detonation had finished rising, not because he'd calculated the odds, not because he'd run a risk assessment, not because anyone had told him to. He moved because there was someone down, and that was the only fact that mattered. The dust on Orith Dane didn't fall the way dust falls on Earth. Low gravity does that. Instead of dropping, it drifted, hung in the thin air like smoke that couldn't decide where to go, catching what little light filtered through the overcast and turning the whole extraction site into something that looked less like a battlefield and more like a fever dream. Visibility dropped to maybe 4 meters in the first 30 seconds after the third detonation. Sound was wrong too. The thin atmosphere compressed the blast waves differently, made everything too sharp and too short, like the world was clearing its throat instead of screaming. Dren moved through it by memory. He'd logged this terrain. He knew where the forward position was from where he'd been standing, knew the bearing, knew the approximate distance. He ran it without being able to see it, and trusted the number in his head the way you trust a number you've checked twice before you needed it. He almost tripped over her. She was down on her left side, secondary arms tucked tight against her torso the way Sovereignty soldiers were trained to protect their joints in a fall. Her primary arms were already trying to push her upright and not getting there. The amber eyes were open, tracking, oriented. She was conscious. She was present. She was trying to get up and her body was filing a formal objection to that plan. Dren dropped to one knee beside her. She looked at him. He looked at her. In that specific fraction of a second, he could see her running the calculation. He could actually see it, the slight shift in her eyes, the way her focus moved from his face to the terrain behind him, to the dust cloud, to the egress situation, and back to him. The lattice, running even now, even here, even with whatever the blast had done to her left side. He didn't wait for the calculation to finish. "Don't get up yet," he said. "Tell me where it hurts." She stared at him for a beat that felt longer than it was. "Left lateral impact, possible rib compromise. My secondary left arm is not responding correctly. Can you walk?" "I can function. That's not what I asked." Another beat. Her eyes did the calculation thing again. "Walking will be slower than mission optimal pace." "I'll take that as a yes," Dren said, and got his shoulder under her primary arm before she could tell him that wasn't the efficient solution. Here's the thing that nobody talks about when they discuss joint operations. The training materials cover tactics, communication protocols, weapons compatibility, chain of command structure. What they don't cover is the specific physical geometry of helping a species stand up when they're built differently than you are. Sovereignty's center of gravity sits slightly higher than human. The secondary arms throw off the balance equation, and the standard human get someone to their feet technique assumes a weight and leverage distribution that just doesn't apply. Dren had figured this out during a completely unrelated incident in year 2 of his assignment, when a Sovereignty logistics officer had slipped on a wet deck plate, and he'd grabbed for the wrong thing and nearly taken them both down. He'd spent 2 weeks after that studying Sovereignty anatomy schematics on his own time, not because anyone told him to, but because it seemed like the kind of thing worth knowing if you were going to work alongside people your whole career. It turned out to be the kind of thing worth knowing right now. He got her up correctly on the first try. She noticed. He could tell she noticed by the slight pause in the lattice eyes before she scanned the terrain again. The rest of the security element was pulling together 8 meters to the east. Valath was there, and 2 of the Sovereignty soldiers who'd been in the secondary position when the detonations hit. The signals team, 3 of the 4, was behind them. One of the humans, the senior signals specialist, had a head wound that was being handled by the Sovereignty field medic. The other human, the junior specialist, was physically fine and looked like someone had just pulled the ground out from under everything he thought he understood about how days work. Dren recognized that look. He'd worn it himself once. You got past it by finding the next task and doing it. The architect was already running the lattice out loud by the time they reached the element. Her voice, that particular flat-focused register that Dren had heard from enough commanding officers to recognize as the sound of someone shutting down everything that isn't operationally relevant. North egress is compromised. South approach has unknown placement. We don't walk into a second ambush blind. East Ridge is the only unconfirmed route, and it adds approximately 6 kilometers to extraction. She looked at the element, at the casualty count, at the signals team, at the array components the team had managed to grab before the third detonation. Her eyes did that thing. We cannot move at mission pace with current personnel status. The array core is secured. Priority is getting the core out. The surrounding components are secondary. Voss said. Understood. Adjusted formation? Yes. She began assigning positions with the economy of someone who had done this so many times the words had worn smooth. She didn't waste syllables. Every soldier got a role and a vector in about 40 seconds. Dren got rear security. Again. He didn't say anything. He took the position. What he also did, while taking the position, was run a count. 12 soldiers on insertion. 2 confirmed down from the first detonations. 1 human casualty being carried. 1 Sovereignti soldier unaccounted for in the immediate tally. Last confirmed position near the primary egress before it collapsed. He did the count twice. He got the same number twice. He looked at the architect and said, "We're missing one. Sovereignti secondary, forward left of primary egress." She didn't stop moving. Confirmed. Forward left was inside the collapse radius of the second detonation. Dren waited. "So, we're going back." She looked at him then. Actually looked at him. Not the terrain scan threat assessment thing, but the kind of look that meant a human had just said something that required processing. The collapsed debris field is 12 meters of unstable rock in an already compromised atmospheric condition. We don't have the equipment for a structural extraction, and the mission timeline doesn't support the attempt. He knew what she was saying. He'd read enough operational reports to understand the language. So that's a no. That is an assessment of mission parameters. Right. He looked at the debris field. He looked at the East Ridge. He looked at the time on his suit display. He ran a number that had nothing to do with the lattice, and everything to do with the fact that he'd been watching the dust drift in the thin air for the last 4 minutes. And dust that moves like that, in that direction at that rate, meant the structural debris wasn't fully settled yet, which meant there were still voids in it, which meant this wasn't actually over the way the parameters said it was. "Give me 8 minutes, he said. She stared at him. "Repeat that." 8 minutes. The debris field is still settling. I can see it in the dust movement. There are voids. If he's in one of them, 8 minutes gets us there and back before the field locks. He paused. "If I'm wrong, you leave without me and the mission timeline holds." The lattice was running behind her eyes. He could see it. "You would accept that outcome," she said. Not a question. Checking a variable. "I'd prefer not to," Dren said. "But yes." The look on her face was something he didn't have a name for yet. He'd learn the name later. Right now he just saw it as the expression of someone who had run a calculation and arrived at an answer that didn't fit any of their existing categories. 7 minutes, she said. "Voss goes with you." Dren was already moving. The debris field was worse up close than it looked from 8 meters. The detonation hadn't just dropped rock. It had sheared the face of the ridge at an angle, creating a layered collapse where the pieces were stacked in a way that made every step a structural question. Low gravity helped with the lifting. It did absolutely nothing for the question of whether the thing above what you were lifting was going to decide now was the moment to come down. The East Ridge route was technically passable. That was the most generous thing you could say about it. The terrain was broken shale overlaid with a thin crust of mineral deposit that looked solid until you put weight on it, at which point it made a sound like someone crumpling paper and gave way by about 2 centimeters. Not enough to be dangerous on a standard gravity world. On Orth Dane, where the low G meant your gait was already adjusted and your balance corrections were already delayed, 2 centimeters of unexpected give every third step was the kind of thing that added up. Your ankles knew it. Your knees filed a formal complaint around kilometer 2. By kilometer 3, everyone in the element was moving with that specific, careful deliberateness that wasn't quite a limp, but was in the same neighborhood. Dren noticed the architect's pace at the front of the column. She was holding it. Whatever the blast had done to her left side, she was holding the pace. But the lattice eyes were doing something different now. Less pure forward scan, more the occasional tight focus that meant something was costing more than she was accounting for in her posture. He'd seen that expression before on soldiers who were operating on the wrong side of an injury they hadn't fully told anyone about. He logged it, kept moving, said nothing. The young soldier, Dren had caught his name in a partial exchange during the debris field extraction, something that sounded like Aaron in the human approximate pronunciation, was mobile and largely intact. But the 4 minutes in a structural void on a thin atmosphere world had done something to his oxygen levels that the suit readings were still trying to catch up on. He was walking under his own power, which was good. He was doing it with the slightly over-deliberate focus of someone who was compensating for a head that wasn't fully cooperating, which was less good. Vovath had taken position beside him without being asked. Not dramatic about it, just present. The kind of presence that said, "I am here in case the math changes," without making it into a whole thing. Dren respected that. It was the military version of the same instinct he'd run on in the debris field, just quieter. The signals team was carrying the array core in a hardened case that one of the Sovereignti soldiers had pulled from secondary equipment. It wasn't heavy and low G. It was awkward, the kind of awkward that requires 2 people and a constant negotiation of grip and angle, and the team was rotating the carry every 15 minutes to manage fatigue without breaking stride. Dren watched the rotation and thought about the weight of things that weren't heavy. Whatever was in that case had generated enough priority to put 12 soldiers on a border world that belonged to nobody, had put the architect on the ground personally instead of running the mission from an orbital position, had generated a joint operation between 2 civilizations whose cooperative history was, if you read it honestly, 61 years of politely not stepping on each other's biggest concerns while calling it alliance. He didn't know what was in the case. He wasn't cleared for it. He was cleared for the terrain, for the spacing, for the 6 o'clock position, and for making sure whatever was in the case made it off the world in one piece. That was the job. He did the job. Vovath moved well. 9 years of training showed in how he handled the terrain. Quick hands, good weight distribution, no wasted motion. They didn't talk much. Dren pointed, Vovath moved. They kept a running clock in their heads the way field soldiers do when the clock is the whole game. 4 minutes and 20 seconds in, Dren heard something. Not an explosion, not a collapse. Something smaller. The specific sound of a gloved hand hitting rock. Twice. A pause. Twice again. He stopped. Held up a fist. Vovath froze. Dren listened. Low-gravity atmospheres were bad for sound travel, but good for directional clarity. Sound didn't scatter the same way. And if you were paying attention, you could triangulate something quiet to within a meter or two. 2 meters left. Down. They moved 2 meters left. Dren crouched and started pulling debris by hand. Not with leverage, because leverage meant movement, and movement meant risk. Just direct removal, piece by piece, passed back to Vovath, who stacked it to the side with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done structural work in his 9 years, and knew how to build a clear zone. 90 seconds later, Dren's hand found a gap. He shone his suit light into it. The missing soldier, young, probably early in his service term, suit intact but visor cracked along the lower left edge, looked up at him with the wide amber eyes of someone who had spent 4 minutes in the dark doing the math on whether anyone was coming, and landed on an answer that hurt. Dren said in his limited sovereignty, which was bad but functional, "Still here. Come on." The young soldier's expression did something complicated. Dren didn't stop to analyze it. He got both hands into the gap and pulled. They came out of the debris field at 6 minutes 40 seconds. Dren knew because he checked. It was the kind of thing you checked. The architect was exactly where she'd said she'd be, at the East Ridge entry. Element formed up and ready to move. She watched them come out of the dust, watched Dren with one arm around the young soldier and Vovath on the other side. The 3 of them moving at a speed that was not fast but was steady and was together. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, to the element, "Move out. Rear security, maintain contact." Dren got the young soldier into the formation, got himself back to rear, checked his weapon, checked his suit display. 6 minutes 40 seconds. He'd had 20 to spare. He didn't mention it. Some things you didn't need to announce. What he didn't know, what he had no way of knowing as they moved east along the ridge toward a 6-kilometer route home, was that the architect had watched him go into that debris field and done something she almost never did. She had run the lattice and then sat with the result for a moment, quietly, before she accepted it, because the lattice had said, acceptable loss. The lattice was usually right. The lattice had been right 11 times before, but the lattice had not accounted for a human who looked at 7 minutes on a clock and decided that was enough time to make the math wrong. 6 kilometers doesn't sound like much until you're walking it on a compromised world with a cracked egress plan, 2 casualties, and the specific knowledge that whoever set those detonations is somewhere on the same rock you're trying to leave. Then 6 kilometers feels like a conversation you're not sure ends well. The East Ridge route was technically passable. That was the most generous thing you could say about it. The terrain was broken shale, overlaid with a thin crust of mineral deposit that looked solid until you put weight on it, at which point it made a sound like someone crumpling paper and gave way by about 2 centimeters. Not enough to be dangerous on a standard gravity world. On Orith Dane, where the low G meant your gait was already adjusted and your balance corrections were already delayed, 2 centimeters of unexpected give every 3rd step was the kind of thing that added up. Your ankles knew it. Your knees filed a formal complaint around kilometer 2. By kilometer 3, everyone in the element was moving with that specific, careful deliberateness that wasn't quite a limp, but was in the same neighborhood. Dren noticed the architect's pace at the front of the column. She was holding it. Whatever the blast had done to her left side, she was holding the pace. But the lattice eyes were doing something different now. Less pure forward scan. More the occasional tight focus that meant something was costing more than she was accounting for in her posture. He'd seen that expression before on soldiers who were operating on the wrong side of an injury they hadn't fully told anyone about. He logged it, kept moving, said nothing. The young soldier, Dren had caught his name in a partial exchange during the debris field extraction, something that sounded like a wren in the human approximate pronunciation, was mobile and largely intact. But the 4 minutes in a structural void on a thin atmosphere world had done something to his oxygen levels that the suit readings were still trying to catch up on. He was walking under his own power, which was good. He was doing it with the slightly over-deliberate focus of someone who was compensating for a head that wasn't fully cooperating, which was less good. Vovath had taken position beside him without being asked. Not dramatic about it, just present. The kind of presence that said, I am here in case the math changes, without making it into a whole thing. Dren respected that. It was the military version of the same instinct he'd run on in the debris field, just quieter. The signals team was carrying the array core in a hardened case that one of the Sovereignti soldiers had pulled from secondary equipment. It wasn't heavy and low G. It was awkward, the kind of awkward that requires 2 people and a constant negotiation of grip and angle. And the team was rotating the carry every 15 minutes to manage fatigue without breaking stride. Dren watched the rotation and thought about the weight of things that weren't heavy. Whatever was in that case had generated enough priority to put 12 soldiers on a border world that belonged to nobody, had put the architect on the ground personally instead of running the mission from an orbital position, had generated a joint operation between 2 civilizations whose cooperative history was, if you read it honestly, 61 years of politely not stepping on each other's biggest concerns while calling it alliance. He didn't know what was in the case. He wasn't cleared for it. He was cleared for the terrain, for the spacing, for the 6 o'clock position, and for making sure whatever was in the case made it off the world in one piece. That was the job. He did the job. Kilometer 4 was where the complication arrived. The scout element, 2 Sovereignti soldiers running about 200 meters ahead of the main column, signaled a contact stop. Everyone dropped into the terrain without a word. That specific, practiced silence of a unit that has trained the noise out of the reaction. Dren was down behind a shale formation before his brain had fully finished processing the signal. Weapon up, sector covered, watching. The architect moved forward in a low crouch to get eyes on the scout report. She was back in 40 seconds. Single thermal signature, she said, voice low and flat. Stationary, 60 meters north of the primary route. Body temperature profile is inconsistent with Sovereignti or human. She paused. It matches the detonation placement signatures from the array site. The element absorbed this. Dren ran the geometry. Single contact, stationary, 60 meters off the route. 3 possibilities. A lookout waiting for the element to move through, a remote trigger operator for a secondary detonation sequence, or someone who'd been left behind by their own people and was now sitting on a cold ridge on a bad world waiting to see how this ended. He said, stationary could mean injured. The architect looked at him. It could also mean bait. Could be both. She considered that, the lattice behind her eyes. What is your assessment of the risk differential? He thought about it the way he actually thought about things, not performing the analysis, but doing it. Walking through the terrain, the spacing, the atmospheric conditions, the timeline. If it's a trigger operator, they've already had 4 minutes to use the trigger and haven't. If it's a lookout, we've already been still long enough that going wide route around them costs less than engaging. If it's injured, leaving them is a choice with a consequence we can't predict. Someone who knows this operation knows the array, knows the joint element composition. He paused. I'm not saying we extract them. I'm saying 60 meters is worth a look before we decide. She watched him for a moment. You volunteer to take that look? I volunteer to take that look. Why? It was a direct question, and she asked it like she genuinely wanted the answer, not like she was testing him. Dren thought about the honest response versus the acceptable response and decided, as he usually did, that the honest one was less work. Because nobody else was going to, he said. Her expression did a thing. Not the lattice eyes, not the focused command face, something that didn't have an obvious operational category. She filed it and moved on. 2 minutes. Veleth covers your 6. Dren went wide left, came around the north side of the contact position from an angle that the terrain should have blocked from direct observation. He moved slow. He moved quiet. He used the shale formations the way he'd use cover on any world, keeping his profile minimal, keeping his movement continuous, but never rushing. He got eyes on the contact at 40 meters. Not Sovereignti, not human. Smaller than either. 3-limbed body plan, wrapped in a thermal layer that had taken shrapnel damage across the right side. One of the limbs was folded wrong in the specific way that meant the joint had failed rather than bent. The figure was sitting with its back to a shale formation, and it was holding something in the functional limb. And after 2 full seconds of careful focus, Dren confirmed it was not a weapon. It was a communication device. Old model, wrong frequency band for Sovereignti military, wrong encryption profile for anything current. The figure was trying to send a signal, and the device was not cooperating. He made a decision. He stood up from cover. Slowly, weapon down and visible, not holstered. He put both hands where they could be seen, weapon hanging from the sling, and he stood in the open air of Orith Dane, at 40 meters distance from a being he'd never encountered before. And he said, in the coalition standard that every signatory species had theoretically agreed to use for first contact situations, I can see you're hurt. I'm not here to make that worse. The figure went very still. Dren stayed exactly where he was. He didn't advance, didn't retreat, just stood in the open like a person who had decided that being visible was less dangerous than being unknown. 15 seconds passed. Then the figure turned its head toward him and said something in a language that Coalition Standard didn't have a translation matrix for yet, but that had, even across the gap of completely alien phonology, the unmistakable rising inflection of a question. Dren didn't understand the words. He understood the question. It was the same question anyone asked when they were hurt and alone and a stranger was standing in the open in front of them. Are you going to hurt me or not? He sat down in the shale, cross-legged, weapon still visible, still on the sling, hands in his lap, made himself the least threatening physical configuration he could manage, and stayed there. The figure watched him for another 10 seconds. Then it put the broken communication device down on the rock beside it, and something in its posture shifted. Not surrender exactly. More like someone who has been holding a lot of weight deciding that this particular moment might be one where they don't have to hold all of it alone. Dren keyed his comm twice, short bursts. The signal he and Veleth had agreed on before he moved out. All clear. Situation changed. Stand by. He heard Veleth's acknowledgement click back. Then he sat on the shale of Orith Dane in the thin, iron-smelling air, and he waited. which was what you did when the situation had moved past what the briefing covered, and into the territory that was just human, just instinct, just the part of you that looked at someone bleeding and decided the math could wait. The architect arrived 4 minutes later. She came alone, which surprised him. She looked at the figure, at Dren, at the distance between them, at the broken communication device on the rock. She was quiet for a moment. "You sat down," she said. "Seemed like the right move. That is not a standard contact protocol." "No," Dren agreed. "It's not." She was doing the lattice eyes again, but it was slower than he'd seen it before. Like the calculation was running into variables it didn't have good weights for. She looked at the figure, who was watching her with the careful stillness of someone who understood that the power balance in this moment had just shifted and wasn't sure which direction. "This individual was part of the team that detonated our extraction site," she said. "Not accusation. Statement of operational fact." "Probably," Dren said. "And you sat down." "They were hurt and alone and trying to call for help on a broken radio." "Yeah, I sat down." She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that he started to wonder if he'd miscalculated something. If the instinct had outrun the situation in a way that was going to cost someone something he hadn't accounted for. Then the architect did something he wasn't expecting. She sat down too. Not cross-legged. Sovereignti anatomy didn't do cross-legged comfortably. She found a flat piece of shale and settled onto it with the controlled precision of someone whose left side was telling her things she was choosing not to prioritize. And she sat there beside him at 40 meters from a being neither of them had a protocol for, and she said, in coalition standard, slowly and clearly, "We are not your enemy today." The figure looked at her, then at Dren, then back at her. Then it said something, again in the untranslated language, but this time the inflection was different. Lower, flatter, the sound of a statement rather than a question. Dren didn't understand the words. He understood the tone. It was the same tone anyone used when they were saying, "I hear you. I'm not sure I believe you yet, but I hear you." He looked at the architect. She was looking at the figure with an expression that was entirely new, something he hadn't seen across 4 hours of a bad mission on a world that was trying to be hostile about it. He didn't have a name for the expression yet. He'd figure it out later. Right now there was a hurt being on a cold ridge, and a 6-kilometer walk to a landing zone, and whatever came after that. And the only thing that mattered was the next right thing, which was to stay seated in the thin iron air of Orith and let the moment be what it was. The lattice, presumably, had not covered this scenario. Dren was not surprised. The lattice was built on history. This was something new. There's a specific kind of quiet that settles over a situation when everyone involved has silently agreed to stop escalating. It's not peace exactly. It's more like a held breath. The moment between the thing that almost happened and the thing that actually will. Soldiers know it. Diplomats know it. Anyone who has ever talked someone back from an edge knows it. It has a texture to it, that quiet. You can feel it on your skin the same way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. Not the storm itself, just the announcement that something is about to be different. That was the quiet on the ridge of Orith. Dren sat in it and did not rush it. That was the whole job right now. Not tactics, not protocols, not the 6-kilometer walk still waiting for them to the east. Just this. Just the space between 3 beings on a broken world who had arrived here from completely different directions and were now, improbably, sitting within 40 meters of each other without anyone making it worse. The figure's name, they would eventually determine through a combination of coalition standard approximation and the figure's own patient repetition, was something that translated phonetically to HFY. Whether that was a personal name, a title, or something that didn't map onto either category cleanly was unclear. Dren used it anyway, because everyone deserved something to be called, and HFY responded to it in a way that suggested it was at least in the right neighborhood. HFY's species didn't appear in any of the contact registries Dren had access to. 3-limbed, bilateral in a loose sense, with a head structure that was wider than it was deep, and a pair of sensory organs positioned more to the sides than the front, which meant the forward field of vision was narrower than human, but the peripheral range was significantly wider. The thermal layer they wore was military-grade by design, but old by manufacture. The kind of equipment that suggested a civilization that had the technology, but not the resources to keep it current. The broken limb was a problem. Not immediately life-threatening from what Dren could observe, but painful and progressively destabilizing on terrain like this. The joint had failed at what would be roughly the mid-limb equivalent of a human knee. HFY had been immobile, not because they were waiting or watching, but because mobile wasn't currently an option. The broken communication device made more sense in that context. Not an operative still on mission, someone who'd been left when the situation changed, trying to call for a pickup that wasn't coming. Dren had seen that situation before. Different species, same math. He opened his field kit. Slow movements, deliberate, keeping everything visible. He took out the compression wrap and the thermal stabilizer and set them on the shale between himself and HFY. And then he waited. He didn't gesture toward the injury. He didn't try to explain. He just put the tools where they could be seen and sat back and let HFY decide what the tools meant. HFY looked at the kit, looked at Dren, looked at the architect, who had not moved and was watching all of this with the particular focused stillness of someone who was taking very careful notes on something they did not have a prior framework for. Then HFY moved the functional limb toward the compression wrap, not picking it up, just touching it, testing the texture, checking whether the object was what it appeared to be. Dren nodded once. HFY looked at the damaged limb, then at the wrap, then at Dren, and made a sound that was somewhere between a question and a permission request. "Yeah," Dren said. "Go ahead." He wasn't sure if HFY understood the words, but HFY picked up the compression wrap and began, slowly and with visible difficulty, attempting to apply it one-handed to a joint they couldn't fully reach from their current position. Dren watched for about 15 seconds. Then he said, "Can I?" and held out his hand. Another pause, longer this time, the sensory organs shifting in that wide peripheral sweep. Then HFY extended the damaged limb. Dren applied the compression wrap the same way he'd applied field medicine his entire career. Efficiently, without ceremony, checking the tension twice and adjusting once. The limb's structure was different enough from human that he had to improvise the anchor points. But pressure was pressure and stabilization was stabilization. And the physics of holding something damaged steady while it healed didn't change based on how many limbs the patient had. When he finished, HFY made a sound he hadn't heard before. Low, held, resonant in a way that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the throat. He filed it and kept it. He'd ask about it later if later ever happened. The architect said in a voice that was quiet enough to not disrupt what the moment was doing, "We need to move within the next 12 minutes to hold extraction timeline." Dren looked at HFY, looked at the terrain, looked at the 12 minutes. "We're not leaving them here," he said. She met his eyes. The lattice was running. He could see it. But it was running slower than it had at the debris field, slower than it had at the contact stop. Like the calculation was encountering a variable it kept having to re-weight. Carrying a non-allied contact adds significant complexity to an already compromised extraction, she said. The operational assessment, I know what the operational assessment says. Then you understand. I understand that 12 minutes ago they were the opposition, and 8 minutes ago I sat down on the ground. And now we're past that, Dren said. Not angry, just clear. We don't leave someone with a broken limb on a world that isn't theirs. That's not an operational assessment. That's just what we do. The architect was quiet. Dren waited. He was good at waiting. He'd been practicing his whole career. What we do, she said finally, repeating it slowly, like she was testing the weight of the phrase. You speak of humanity collectively. Yeah, you are confident that is accurate, that this is not specific to you. He thought about his family, his grandmother who used to bring food to the neighbor who'd stopped speaking to her over a property dispute 20 years ago. Because, she said, people don't stop being people just because they're being difficult about a fence line. His father, who'd spent 2 weeks of his own leave helping a colleague he barely liked move apartments because the colleague had mentioned offhand that he had nobody to ask. His sister, who worked emergency medicine and never, in 12 years, had left a shift without making sure every patient she'd seen that day had someone with them. Yeah, he said, pretty confident. The architect looked at HFY, at the compression wrap on the damaged limb, at the broken communication device on the rock. Then she turned to the element and said, in that flat, operational voice that didn't invite debate, We're adjusting formation. Carry protocol for non-ambulatory contact. Voss, rear left. Specialist Voss, coordinate. Dren organized the carry in 3 minutes. It wasn't elegant. The geometry was completely wrong for standard human sovereignty carry protocols because HFY was neither. But he worked out a configuration with Voss that distributed the weight without putting pressure on the damaged limb, and HFY tolerated it with what he was increasingly reading as deliberate patience. The kind of patience that isn't passive, that's a choice being actively made over and over. The element moved out. The architect at front, Dren at rear. 6 kilometers still waiting. They covered the first 2 kilometers without contact. The terrain was bad but manageable. The young soldier, Aaron, was steadying out as the oxygen debt from his time in the debris field slowly cleared. The signals team kept the array case moving. The formation held. In the 3rd kilometer, the architect dropped back from the front for the first time. She came alongside Dren. He glanced at her, said nothing, let her start it. The being you call HFY, she said. You assessed them as non-threatening before you had evidence to support that assessment. I assessed them as hurt, Dren said. That was the evidence. That is not the same thing. No, but for me it's usually the first thing. She walked with that for a moment. The terrain crunched under their boots in that 2-centimeter give-way that had been aggravating everyone's ankles for 3 kilometers. At the debris field, she said, when you went in for Aaron, you told me that if you were wrong, I should leave without you. Yeah. Did you believe I would? He thought about the honest answer versus the comfortable one. He always came back to the same choice. I believed you'd follow the lattice. And that did not change your decision. No. She was quiet for about 50 meters of broken shale. Why not? He looked at the formation ahead of them, at Aaron moving steadily under his own power, at Voss on the carry position beside HFY, at the signals team and the array case and the 6-kilometer route that was now down to 3. Because it wasn't about what you would do, he said. It was about what I would do. Those are different calculations. The lattice eyes. But slower. The way they'd been getting slower all afternoon. You separate the question of your own conduct from the question of consequences, she said, like she was mapping it, trying to find where it fit in a framework that hadn't been built to hold it. I guess I do, Dren said. I don't think I do it consciously. It's more that, when there's someone down, the first question isn't about outcome. The first question is, what do I do right now? The outcome question comes later. And if the outcome is negative, then I was wrong about the specifics and right about the principle. She processed that for another 50 meters. The wind shifted, carrying a thin trace of iron and something else. Something almost sweet underneath it that didn't have a reference point in anything he'd smelled before. Oreth Dane doing whatever Oreth Dane did. That is not logical, she said. No, he agreed. But it's consistent. She stopped walking. He stopped with her. The element moved on ahead, maintaining spacing. Voss glancing back and then forward again, handling it. She was looking at him with an expression he was slowly building a vocabulary for. He'd seen pieces of it in the debris field. He'd seen it again when she sat down on the ridge. He was starting to understand it wasn't one thing. It was several things happening in the same face at the same time. The lattice encountering something it was going to have to expand to account for, and the person behind the lattice deciding whether to let it. The lattice is built on recorded outcomes, she said. The behavior of species across centuries. The probability weights that have proven most accurate over the longest sample size. I know, Dren said. 61 years of joint operations. I've read the framework documents. Humanity's probability weights in the lattice are currently classified as unpredictable with moderate positive outcomes in low-stakes engagements. She said it without apology. Just the fact of it. It is not a dismissal. It is an accurate reflection of limited data. I know that too. Today is adding data. He looked at her. Is it adding it in the right direction? She held his gaze for a moment. The expression doing that thing. The thing he still didn't have one word for. Yes, she said, simply, directly, without the lattice in it. Then she moved back to the front of the formation, and he went back to rear security, and they covered the last 3 kilometers without another word between them. But something had shifted in the quiet of Oreth Dane. The way things shift when a calculation that's been running on incomplete data finally gets a new number to work with. The landing zone was a flat mineral shelf about 200 meters in diameter, swept clear of the worst shale by whatever geological process had decided to be convenient about it. The extraction shuttle was not there when they arrived. It was, according to the updated timeline the architect had pulled during the march, 7 minutes out. 7 minutes on the ground with a compromised position on a world that had already demonstrated it didn't want them there. Dren set the perimeter. He put Voss on north, himself on south, the able Sovereignti soldiers on east and west, and he arranged the interior of the perimeter with the signals team and the array case at center, the casualties behind them, and HFY at a position that was inside the perimeter but at its edge, which was the honest spatial acknowledgement of the situation. Not prisoner, not ally. Something that didn't have a name in the operational manual but needed a location anyway. He checked on HFY once during the 7 minutes. The compression wrap was holding. The damaged limb was immobile and stable. HFY was watching the sky with those wide peripheral eyes that could see things Dren couldn't. He wondered what they saw. At minute 5, HFY made a sound. Low, directional, pointing with the functional limb toward the northern quadrant. Dren keyed his comm. Voss. North check. Voss swept north, came back 10 seconds later. 2 thermal signatures, mobile, moving away from the LZ. Moving away, not converging. Whoever was on the northern ridge had seen the perimeter and made a different decision. Dren looked at HFY. HFY looked back at him with those wide, amber-adjacent sensory organs. He said, "Thank you." He didn't know if the words translated. He was fairly sure the tone did. The extraction shuttle came down at minute 7, exactly on the updated timeline, its thrusters kicking up a low-G cloud of mineral dust that drifted instead of falling, and turned the landing into something that looked, just for a moment, like something out of a story someone would tell later. Dren was last onto the shuttle. He always was. It was a rear security thing. Also, if he was honest, it was a personal thing. He didn't leave until the ground was clear. He stood in the hatch for a moment before he stepped in, looking at the flat mineral shelf of Orcs and the drifting dust and the ridge where the detonations had gone off, and the 6 kilometers of broken shale they'd just walked. The mission had gone wrong in 3 places, and right in about 6. The array corps was on the shuttle. 11 of 12 soldiers were aboard and breathing. HFY was on the shuttle, which was either a complication or the beginning of something that didn't have a name yet. He stepped inside. The hatch closed behind him. On the other side of the shuttle, the architect was reviewing the operational log with the focused efficiency of someone who was already building the after-action report in their head. But as the shuttle lifted off the mineral shelf and Orcs dropped away beneath them, she looked up from the log, across the interior of the shuttle, at him. He met the look. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. Some things that happen in a day don't need a sentence put around them right away. They just need to be acknowledged, recognized, set aside in a part of your mind marked with a small flag that says, "This one mattered. Come back to this one." He looked at the flag. He came back to it. The shuttle ride back to the orbital station took 41 minutes. Dren spent most of it doing what soldiers do in the aftermath of a bad day. Running a quiet internal inventory of everything that had happened, checking for the things your body noticed and your brain hadn't processed yet. A bruised rib from where he'd gone down hard on the shale in the first contact drop. A raw patch on his left palm from pulling debris by hand in the collapse field. The low-grade altitude headache from Orcs' atmosphere that was already starting to release now that the shuttle's oxygen system had taken over. Retreating from behind his eyes like something that had been visiting and finally decided to leave. Physical inventory complete. Status, functional. Cost, acceptable. He thought about that word, acceptable. He'd been using it in the standard military sense his whole career, had applied it to himself without hesitation in the debris field when he told the architect to leave without him if the math didn't work. Acceptable loss. A phrase built for operational reports and command briefings, a clean container for a complicated reality. The reality being that acceptable didn't mean it didn't cost anything. It just meant the cost had been weighed and cleared by someone with the authority to weigh it. What he kept thinking about in the 41 minutes of shuttle ride was who had that authority and where it came from and what it required of the person holding it. The architect had that authority. She'd used it 11 times. She'd used it on this mission, twice. Once on the collapsed egress position before Dren had taken the 7 minutes to prove her wrong about the debris field, and once by proxy, in the operational math that would have left HFY on the ridge as an unresolved contact. Dren didn't hold that against her. He wanted to be honest about that. The lattice wasn't cruelty. He'd meant it when he said it, and he still meant it. The lattice was a system built over centuries to preserve the maximum number of lives in the most number of situations, and systems like that were built on the understanding that they would fail specific cases in order to succeed at the general one. It was rational. It was internally consistent. It had worked for a very long time. It just wasn't the only way to run the numbers. HFY was in the rear section of the shuttle, separated from the main element not by locked doors or restraints, but by the simple social geometry of people sitting on the same bench as the things they felt certain about. Nobody had told the soldiers to avoid that section. Nobody had needed to. HFY sat there with the compression-wrapped limb extended and the wide peripheral eyes half closed, and Dren couldn't tell if they were resting or watching or doing something that didn't translate into either category. He got up at minute 20 and went to the rear section. He sat down 2 seats away, enough distance to not be crowding, close enough to be deliberate. HFY's eyes opened, or the sensory organs did. He was still working out the vocabulary. He didn't have anything prepared to say. That was fine. Prepared things had a tendency to be wrong anyway. "How's the limb?" he said. HFY looked at the compression wrap, then at him, then made a sound that had an upward inflection that he was increasingly reading as their version of a functional acknowledgement. "Good," he said. "It'll need proper treatment when we get to station. I don't know what that looks like for your species, but I'll make sure someone figures it out." He had no guarantee he could make that happen. He said it anyway because it was the right direction to aim in, and sometimes naming the direction was how you started getting there. HFY said something then. Not the functional acknowledgement, not the question inflection. Something longer, with a specific cadence to it that felt intentional, like they were trying to carry information in the shape of the sound, even without a shared vocabulary to carry it in. Dren listened. He listened the way he listened to terrain, not for specific data, but for the overall shape of what was being communicated. When HFY finished, he said, "I don't understand the words, but I think I got the general idea." HFY made the low, resonant sound he'd heard on the ridge, the one he'd filed for later. He was starting to think it meant something like acknowledged or received, the sound of information landing somewhere it was going to be kept. The architect appeared at the entrance to the rear section at minute 31. She looked at Dren, at HFY, at the 2-seat gap between them. She came and sat down on the other side of HFY, equidistant, mirroring the geometry without being asked. Dren looked at her. She looked straight ahead. "I've been composing the after-action report," she said. "How's it going?" "It requires more categories than the standard template provides." "I imagine it does." She was quiet for a moment. The shuttle hummed around them, the specific low-frequency hum of an orbital approach, the sound of gravity becoming theoretical again. "The debris field extraction," she said. 6 minutes 40 seconds. "Yeah." The lattice projected 0 viable outcome for that attempt, given available equipment, personnel status, and time constraint. "I know." The lattice was wrong. He looked at her. She was still looking straight ahead, but there was something in the set of her jaw that suggested this was a sentence that had cost something to say. "The lattice was working with the information it had," Dren said. "It wasn't wrong. It was incomplete." She considered that. "The distinction matters to you." "Yeah. A system that was wrong needs to be replaced. A system that was incomplete needs better data." He paused. "Better data is available now." The lattice eyes moved, slower than ever. He was getting familiar with what it looked like when the lattice was rewriting rather than just calculating. "You understand the lattice well enough to argue for its accuracy while simultaneously demonstrating its limitations," she said. "I read the framework documents," he said. "All of them, including the design philosophy sections that most people skip." She turned her head and looked at him directly. "Why did you read the design philosophy sections?" "Because understanding why a system was built the way it was tells you more about where it breaks down than understanding how it operates." He shrugged. "If I'm going to work inside someone else's framework for years at a time, I want to understand its architecture. It's respectful, for one thing, and it's useful." She was quiet for a long time, long enough that the shuttle's descent tone sounded, indicating 10 minutes to orbital station docking. "You have been on joint operations with Sovereignti units for how long?" she said. 3 years, 4 months. "And in that time you have read the Lattice framework documents. You have studied Sovereignti anatomy independently. You have learned enough operational Sovereignti language to function at approximately 70% fluency." She paused. "These were not requirements of your assignment." "No." "Why then?" He looked at the forward section of the shuttle, at Valath sitting beside Aaron, the two of them running what looked like a quiet post-operation debrief between themselves, the kind of informal exchange that happened outside the official report, at the signals team with the array case secured between their feet, at the element that had gone in as 12 and come back as 11.5 and a complication, which was not a perfect outcome but was a real one. "Because these are the people I work with," he said. "Understanding them isn't extra, it's the job." HFY made a sound between them. Both of them looked. HFY's sensory organs were tracking between Dren and the architect with the focused attention of someone following a conversation they can't quite hear clearly, but are working hard to read. Dren had a thought. He didn't examine it very hard before he acted on it, which was generally how his better decisions happened. He took out his personal comm and pulled up the Coalition Standard Translation Matrix. It was limited. It didn't have an entry for HFY's language because that language hadn't been cataloged yet. But it had a recording function, and it had a pattern matching function that could start building a rough translation model if it had enough audio input to work with. He set the recording function running and placed the comm on the seat between himself and HFY and said, in Coalition Standard, slowly and clearly, "This is going to take a while to work, but I'd like it if we could talk eventually." HFY looked at the device, looked at Dren, made the low resonant sound again, received, kept, noted. The architect watched this. She watched the way Dren did things generally, he was starting to notice, with a completeness of attention that was different from observation, different from assessment. It was the attention of someone building a model of something they hadn't encountered before, filling in details with the patience of a person who understood that the model would take time and intended to build it correctly. "At the contact site," she said, "when you stood up from cover, in the open, no cover, weapon down. Yeah. That was the highest risk decision you made today. Probably. More than the debris field, more than the carry protocol with a non-allied contact. Maybe. I didn't rank them at the time. What were you thinking when you did it?" Dren thought back to the moment, the 40-meter distance, the broken radio, the figure that was hurt and alone and trying to call for help. He tried to identify what had been in his head. "I was thinking that if I stayed in cover, the situation would stay whatever it was," he said slowly. "Which was bad for everyone. And if I stood up and it went wrong fast and it was over. But if I stood up and it went right, even a little bit right, then something different was possible. You were calculating probability. I was calculating possibility. That's different." She looked at him. "Explain the difference." "Probability is what's likely to happen based on what's happened before. Possibility is what could happen if you do something that hasn't been tried yet." He paused. "The Lattice runs on probability. I don't think it runs on possibility." The shuttle docked. The lock pressure equalized. The forward hatch opened and the element began moving out in the organized way of a unit that did this often enough to do it without being told. The architect stood. She stood with the controlled precision she'd maintained for the entire 6-kilometer walk and the 41-minute shuttle ride. The precision of someone who had decided that their left side was going to cooperate, and the left side had accepted the terms. She looked down at Dren, who was still seated, and at HFY beside him, and at the comm recording patiently between them. "The after-action report," she said, "is going to be interesting to write. I'll submit whatever you need from my end," he said. "Yes." She looked at HFY one more time. Something in her face that wasn't the Lattice. "But I meant it will be interesting. I have not written many reports where the data required new categories." She moved toward the hatch. Dren looked at HFY, made a gesture he'd worked out during the walk. Both hands up, then a slow forward motion, which he'd been using consistently enough across the last 2 hours that it seemed to have registered as meaning something like, "Let's move," or "this way." HFY stood. Slow, careful, the compression-wrapped limb held slightly off the floor, but standing. Dren fell in alongside, matching the pace without making it into a thing. The way you walked next to someone who needed a slightly different rhythm without drawing attention to the fact that you'd adjusted. His grandmother had done it with his grandfather after the knee surgery. That same natural recalibration of pace that said, "I'm not slowing down for you. I just happen to be going this speed." He stepped through the hatch into the orbital station, with an unregistered three-limbed being on one side and a missing category in every existing operational manual on the other. And he thought that this was probably the part nobody in the mission briefing had covered. He also thought that the recording on the comm had 12 minutes of audio now. Not enough for a translation matrix. A start, though. A start was how everything began. Orbital Station Kareth 7 was not built for ambiguity. That was the thing you noticed about it immediately, if you'd spent enough time in places designed around uncertainty to recognize its absence. Every corridor was labeled in 4 languages. Every junction had a directional protocol. Every species that passed through had a designated processing pathway, a medical clearance lane, a cultural liaison assigned from a registry that had been maintained and updated for 61 years of joint operations. The station worked because it had a category for everything, and everything stayed in its category. HFY did not have a category. Dren watched the intake process run into this problem in real time. The station's duty officer, a Sovereignti administrator named Rel Sovath, who had the practiced efficiency of someone who had processed thousands of arrivals, and the particular expression of someone who had just encountered something that was not in the thousands, looked at HFY, looked at his intake display, looked at Dren, and said in precise coalition standard, "Species registration. Unregistered," Dren said. "Alliance affiliation. Pending. Contact classification." Dren thought about the word for what HFY was, which was someone hurt and alone on a hostile world, who had told 2 beings on a ridge that they heard them, even if they didn't believe them yet. None of those words were in the classification registry. "Humanitarian recovery," he said. Rel Sovath looked at him for a moment, then at HFY, then back at the intake display, where he typed something with the deliberate keystrokes of a person making an official decision they were going to have to defend later to someone in a better office. "Humanitarian recovery," he repeated. "Medical Bay 3. I'll need a complete incident report within 6 hours." "You'll have it," Dren said. He didn't know yet whether that was true. He aimed at it anyway. Medical Bay 3 was designed for Sovereignti physiology primarily, and had accommodation protocols for 11 other registered species. It did not have an accommodation protocol for HFY. What it had was a medical officer named Sovereignti, who had been practicing cross-species medicine for 19 years, who looked at HFY for about 30 seconds, and then said, in the tone of someone genuinely interested rather than professionally obligated, "This is going to require some improvisation." "I know," Dren said. "You good with that?" Sovereignti was already pulling up anatomy schematics on the bay display, working from the visual survey the way a good diagnostician worked, building a picture from what was observable before going deeper. "I've been practicing cross-species medicine for 19 years, she said. "Improvisation is the job." She glanced at Dren. "The compression wrap on the mid-limb, that was field application?" "Yeah. Tensions set at human standard for joint stabilization. I didn't have reference points for their physiology." "It held the limb correctly. The joint structure is analogous enough that the pressure gradient works," she said it matter-of-factly, but he caught the slight upward adjustment in her tone that meant she was filing something. "Who trained you in cross-species field medicine?" "Nobody," Dren said. "I read." She looked at him fully for the first time. "You read Sovereignti anatomy schematics and 6 other registered species. I've been on joint operations for 3 years. Seemed worth knowing." She held the look for a beat. Then she went back to the display. "Leave me the comm recording. The vocalizations may help with pain communication during treatment." He handed her the comm. 12 minutes of audio. Not enough for a translation matrix, but she was right that it might help with the immediate task. He watched her set it running in the background while she began the careful process of assessing HFY's damaged limb with the deliberate patience of someone doing new work correctly rather than fast. HFY watched her too, the wide peripheral sensory organs tracking her movements with that focused attention Dren was coming to understand as their version of active engagement. Not fear, not submission. Attention. The attention of someone who had decided this situation was worth watching carefully. He left them to it. He had a report to write. The after-action room was a small office off the main operations corridor, with a desk, a display, and a chair sized for Sovereignti dimensions that was slightly too tall for human use, in a way that had probably never bothered anyone enough to fix. Dren sat in it anyway, and pulled up the report template, and stared at the category fields for a moment. The template had fields for mission parameters, personnel status, equipment status, contact classification, outcome assessment, and recommendations. It did not have a field for the moment when a Sovereignti commander sat down on a ridge beside a human soldier and an unregistered three-limbed being and said, "We are not your enemy today," without the lattice in her voice. He wrote the factual sections first. That was always the right starting point. What happened? When? Where? Who was present? What was the sequence? He was good at the factual sections. He had a memory for details that his instructors in BASIC had called unusually retentive, which he'd always taken as a compliment even though he suspected it wasn't entirely meant as one. He was halfway through the contact classification section when the architect appeared in the doorway. She had changed out of her field kit and was in station dress, which for Sovereignti Command was a deep gray fitted suit with rank indicators along the collar that Dren had learned to read around month 8 and could now clock in about 2 seconds. The left side of the suit sat slightly differently than the right, which was the only external indication of whatever the medical bay had confirmed about her ribs. "The report," she said. "Working on it," he said. She came in and sat in the secondary chair, which was human-sized, and had probably been installed for exactly this kind of joint administrative situation. She pulled up her own display, and they worked in parallel for a few minutes in the specific comfortable quiet of two people doing adjacent tasks in the same room. Then she said without looking up from her display, "The lattice designation for today's operation is currently logging as mission partial success, 3 acceptable losses, 1 unresolved contact." Dren kept writing his own report. 3. 2 from the primary detonation sequence, 1 from the secondary egress collapse. He understood. The lattice had logged Aaron as an acceptable loss before the debris field extraction changed the outcome. The log reflected what the lattice had projected at the moment the call was made, not what actually happened. Standard operational documentation. "The unresolved contact," he said. "HFY does not have an operational classification in the lattice. The contact outcome field is currently blank. What options does the field have? Neutralized, extracted, released, detained, transferred." Dren thought about HFY and Medical Bay 3, watching Sarental work with the careful attention of someone deciding whether trust was a reasonable investment. Thought about the compression wrap he'd applied in the field. Thought about the 12 minutes of audio on the comm and the low, resonant sound that meant received. "None of those are right," he said. "No," she agreed. "They are not." She was quiet for a moment. "I am going to recommend a new field designation in the lattice review submission. Pending contact, indicating a contact whose classification cannot be determined from available data and requires extended assessment." "That's a good category," Dren said. "It is a category that did not exist before today." He kept writing. She kept working. After another few minutes, she said, "The young soldier, Aren. He has submitted his own incident report." Dren looked up. "Already?" Aren is thorough. Something in her voice that might have been dry affection, the kind that commanding officers developed for soldiers who kept them on their toes. In the report, he describes the debris field extraction. He states that he heard a voice through the rock before Specialist Voss made contact. He states that the voice said, "Still here," and that this was the information that told him rescue was occurring, rather than further detonation. Dren thought about the 40-second timeline in the debris field. The 2-meter move left, the gap in the rock. "I didn't know he could hear me," he said. "He could." She looked at her display. He also states that the 2 words were sufficient, that he did not need more information than that to decide to hold position and preserve his oxygen until extraction. She paused. "He is 19 cycles old. This was his 3rd field operation." Dren did the conversion. 19 sovereignty cycles was roughly 15.5 human years. He'd known sovereignty soldiers trained young, had known it abstractly, but the specific number landing next to the specific image of that amber-eyed face looking up at him through the gap in the debris, with the expression of someone who had been alone in the dark doing the math on whether anyone was coming. He went back to the report. He wrote the next section. He did it carefully. They worked in parallel for 20 more minutes. The station hummed around them. That deep, low-frequency station hum that was different from a ship's hum, more constant, more assured. The sound of a structure that had been in one place long enough to know it was staying. The architect said, "I want to ask you something that is not in the after-action template." He set his stylus down. "Go ahead." She looked at him directly, the lattice quiet behind her eyes. "When you told me that you separated the question of your own conduct from the question of consequences, that you acted first and calculated later, is that something you decided to do, or something you found yourself doing and then decided to keep?" It was the kind of question that deserved a real answer. He gave it the time it needed. "Found first," he said. "Decided to keep later, after I understood it well enough to defend it." "And you defend it how?" "I defend it by pointing at the outcomes," he said. "Not to say the instinct is always right. It isn't. But I'd rather have an instinct toward action and correct for the specific case than have no instinct and wait for the calculation every time. The calculation takes time. Sometimes time is the thing you don't have. The lattice accounts for time as a variable. The lattice accounts for time as a constraint. That's different from time as something you're spending while someone is down." She sat with that. He could see it moving through the lattice framework, finding the load-bearing points, checking the angles. "The design philosophy of the lattice," she said finally, "was written by a commander named Rel Sovath approximately 3 centuries ago. Velrath lost a full battle group in a single engagement because of what the post-analysis classified as emotionally motivated tactical overreach. The lattice was built as the corrective system, the system that would ensure that feeling never again outran thinking in a sovereignty command structure. "I know," Dren said. "It's in the design philosophy documents, Chapter 2. She looked at him with an expression that he was increasingly able to read. The one that said, "You continue to have done the reading I did not expect you to have done." Velrath's battle group loss was 7,000 soldiers, she said. The lattice has prevented the equivalent of that loss approximately 40 times over in the 3 centuries since. The math is not ambiguous. "The math isn't ambiguous," Dren agreed. "The math is right. I'm not arguing with the math." "Then what are you arguing?" "I'm arguing that Velrath didn't fail because he felt things. He failed because the feeling wasn't connected to anything disciplined. The corrective to undisciplined feeling isn't no feeling. It's disciplined feeling." He paused. "The lattice corrected for the wrong thing. It corrected for the emotion instead of the discipline around it." The room was quiet. She was doing the lattice thing, but it looked different this time. Not the rapid tactical assessment, not the slower recalibration he'd been watching all day. Something longer. Something that looked like a system stress-testing a foundational assumption. "That," she said carefully, "is the most consequential thing anyone has said to me about the lattice in 22 years of using it." "It might be wrong," he said honestly. "It might be," she agreed. "I need to think about it. Take your time. It's not going anywhere." She returned to her report. He returned to his. The station hummed. At the bottom of the contact classification section, he typed, HFY, status, pending. Conduct toward element, cooperative following initial stabilization. Prognosis for ongoing engagement, positive. Recommended classification, see attached recommendation for new lattice category, pending contact. He flagged it for her review before submission. He went to Medical Bay 3 at the end of the report cycle. Sarental had stabilized the damaged limb with a custom brace she'd built from components designed for 3 different registered species, which was the kind of creative engineering that 19 years of cross-species medicine produced. HFY was in a reclined position that the station's adjustable medical furniture had been configured into, and the sensory organs were fully open, tracking. The comm was on the side table, Sarental had added 2 hours of audio to the recording during the treatment session. She'd talked to HFY throughout, she told Dren. Not because she expected comprehension, but because her experience was that continuous calm vocalization during an unfamiliar medical procedure consistently reduced stress indicators across every species she'd worked with. Does that apply cross-species? Dren asked. Today it did, she said simply. He sat beside the medical bed. He picked up the comm. 2 hours and 12 minutes of audio. Still not a translation matrix. Getting closer to a start. He looked at HFY. HFY looked back. Tomorrow's going to be complicated, he said. There's going to be a lot of people who want to ask you a lot of questions, and none of them are going to have a translation matrix either. He paused. I'll be there for whatever that looks like. I don't know if that's useful information, but it's true. HFY made the low, resonant sound. Received. Kept. Noted. Dren set the comm back on the table and sat in the chair beside the medical bed for a while. The station hummed. The audio recording ran. Outside the small window of Medical Bay 3, the stars of the outer systems held their positions against the dark, patient and unchanged and completely indifferent to the question of whether 3 beings on a cold ridge on a nameless world had decided to try something that didn't have a protocol yet. The stars didn't need to care. That was fine. That was what stars were for. The caring was a different job. He was good at that job. 3 months after Oreth Dane, a translation matrix for HFY's language existed. Not a complete one. Languages didn't work that way, didn't yield themselves fully to any timeline that felt satisfying, didn't compress into clean packages just because someone needed them to, but a functional one, enough to carry a conversation without too much falling through the gaps, enough to understand, most of the time, what was being meant even when the words didn't map perfectly onto any existing framework. Sarental had built the foundation from the audio recordings. Dren had contributed about 40 hours of direct interaction sessions across the 3 months. Sitting in Medical Bay 3 and then later in a small conference room, the station had quietly stopped scheduling for other things, because everyone on the administrative side had apparently decided without formal discussion that the room was being used for something that mattered. HFY had been patient with the process in the specific way of someone who understood that being understood was worth the time it cost to get there. The architect had attended 11 of the 40 sessions. She had not explained why. Dren had not asked. Some things announced themselves clearly enough without words around them. The first full conversation Dren had with HFY, through the functional translation matrix, happened on a Tuesday, which was a human calendar designation that meant nothing to anyone else on the station, but that Dren noted privately because he was the kind of person who noted the specific timestamps of things that mattered. They were in the conference room. Sarental was there with the translation interface. The architect was there. HFY was there with the healed limb and the wide peripheral sensory organs, and the particular composed attention that Dren had been reading for 3 months and still found he could learn new things from. Dren said through the interface, "I've been wanting to ask you something since the ridge." The interface processed. HFY's response came back in the flat, synthesized voice of early-stage translation matrices, which stripped out everything that wasn't the words themselves. Ask. When I stood up from cover, when I sat down on the ground in front of you, what did you think was happening? HFY was quiet for a moment. The response that came back was longer than Dren expected, and the matrix flagged 3 words as uncertain translation, meaning the closest English approximation was being used, but might not be fully accurate. I thought you were performing a submission, surrender, yielding, display, HFY said through the matrix. My people have a form of this. When a conflict reaches a point where continuation serves no one, the party with the stronger position makes themselves temporarily visible, exposed, undefended, to signal that they are choosing a different outcome. I had not seen it done by a species not my own. I was not certain it was being done intentionally. Dren processed that. And when I sat down, then I was certain. A being who sits on the ground in front of you is not calculating. They are communicating. I understood the communication. A pause. I was not certain I believed it, but I understood it. He thought about that for a while. about the thing he'd done by instinct and what it had looked like from the other side, and how those two things had accidentally matched up in a way that had nothing to do with planning, about the gap between what you intend and what lands, and the luck involved in those two things aligning. "I didn't know that's what I was doing," he said. "The sitting. I just did it," the Matrix processed. HFY's response carried the flagged word again. Instinct, reflex, knowing without learning. "Yes, that is visible in how you moved. My people say that the most honest communications are the ones the speaker does not plan. Planning introduces the possibility of performance. What you did was not performance." Dren looked at the architect. She was looking at the display with the focused expression he'd come to understand as the one she wore when something was being added to the framework she'd been quietly rebuilding since Orith Dane. "Your people," Dren said to HFY. "Where are they?" This pause was longer. The Matrix returned a longer response, with more flagged words. "Far from here. We have not had contact with anyone outside our own systems for a long time, many generations, longer than I can personally know. We knew others existed. We did not know if others could be trusted. Our experience suggested caution." "What changed your assessment?" Dren said. "On the ridge. You sat down," HFY said. Simple, direct, no flagged words. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Sarental said, from behind the translation interface, in the voice of someone who had been doing careful professional work for 3 months and was now allowing themselves one sentence of something personal, "I think that might be the clearest description of human diplomacy I've ever heard." The architect said nothing. But she wrote something on her personal display that she didn't share and didn't explain, and that Dren suspected was going into a document that wasn't an after-action report. He was right about that. He'd find out later. The formal investigation into the Orith Dane operation ran parallel to everything else, the way formal investigations always do, in its own lane, on its own timeline, largely disconnected from the human reality of what had happened. Committees met. Reports were reviewed. The Signals Array Core was analyzed by intelligence teams whose conclusions were classified at a level Dren was not cleared for, and probably never would be. The faction responsible for planting the detonations was identified through a chain of evidence that took 8 weeks to fully document, and resulted in an internal Sovereignti security proceeding that Dren heard about in summary and did not envy anyone involved in. The official outcome of the investigation was classified as mission-qualified success, which was the bureaucratic language for it went wrong in several places, but the primary objective was recovered, and the losses were within projected parameters. Clean language, accurate in the narrow sense, missing most of what had actually happened. Arn submitted a supplemental report that was 4 times the standard length, and which his immediate superior had apparently spent considerable time trying to persuade him to condense. Arn had declined. The full report was entered into the record. Dren read it in full. It was the most detailed first-person account of 6 minutes 40 seconds that he had ever encountered, and it included, in precise Sovereignti administrative language, the statement that Specialist Voss's verbal contact through the debris structure was the determining factor in my decision to conserve oxygen and remain in position. The 2 words communicated, "still here," contained sufficient operational information to maintain defensive posture and signal awareness for the duration of extraction. 2 words, sufficient operational information. Dren thought about that a lot in the weeks after. About the compression ratio of meaning. About how much could be carried in small containers when the containers were the right shape. Still here. Not, "I am coming for you." Not, "Hold on, help is on the way." Not any of the longer, more complete sentences he could have said. Just, "still here." Just the most fundamental fact of the situation reduced to its irreducible core. A person. Present. Accounted for. Not gone. He thought about all the times in his career he'd been told he was supplementary, complementary, a warm body with a flag patch present for coalition optics. He thought about the evidence file he'd been keeping in his head for 3 years, 4 months, and some additional days now. All the times the complementary position had turned out to be the position that mattered. He didn't add it to the file. The file was for documentation. This was something else. This was the thing you let land without a category. The architect's lattice review submission went to the Sovereignti Command Council 6 weeks after Orith Dane. It was 47 pages. Dren was not given a copy. It was an internal sovereignty document, and he had no clearance for it. But the architect told him, in the conference room with the translation interface running, what the central argument was. The lattice was built to correct for undisciplined emotional response, she said. The design philosophy identified emotion as the failure point in Velrath's engagement, and engineered a system to minimize emotional influence on tactical decisions. The submission argues that this was the correct corrective for an incorrect diagnosis. The failure in Velrath's engagement was not emotional response. It was emotional response without structural discipline around it. The corrective should have been disciplined emotion, not its removal. HFY was in the room. The translation matrix carried this to them and back. After a moment, HFY said through the matrix, "My people had a similar debate, many generations, a long time ago. We resolved it differently. We built the discipline into the emotion rather than separating them." "How did that work?" the architect said. "You are talking to someone who did not fire a weapon at two beings who were clearly within range," HFY said. "Draw your own conclusion." The room was quiet for a moment. Then the architect said, "Yes, I think I will." What happened after the review submission was not fast. Institutional change never was. The Sovereignti Command Council was not in the business of rapid revision. They had not maintained the lattice for 3 centuries by being impulsive about changing it. There were counter-submissions. There were debates that ran through multiple council sessions. There were sovereignty officers who had built entire careers on the lattice as it stood, and who felt, reasonably, that 47 pages from a field commander based on a single operation was not sufficient grounds to revise a foundational doctrine. The architect anticipated every counter-argument and had a response to each one that was, by the account of the council secretary who would later describe the proceedings to a historian, almost unsettlingly well prepared, as if she had been building the arguments not for 6 weeks but for considerably longer, and the operation had simply given her the data she needed to make them. The revision passed 9 months after Orith Dane. It was not a wholesale rewrite of the lattice. It was an amendment, a new section in the design philosophy chapter, before the operational framework, that addressed the foundational premise on which the lattice had been built. It acknowledged Velrath's engagement and the original diagnosis, and then, in the precise, careful language of institutional revision, stated that subsequent evidence across 3 centuries, and in particular evidence arising from joint operations with allied species, had indicated that the original diagnosis was incomplete. The failure was not feeling. The failure was feeling without discipline. The lattice, from that amendment forward, would account for both. The amendment was 3 paragraphs. The last paragraph cited the Orith Dane operation. It cited specifically 2 decisions: the debris field extraction at 6 minutes 40 seconds, and the open ground contact approach at the northern ridge. It cited them not as examples of emotional overreach that had fortunately produced positive outcomes despite violating the lattice's operational parameters. It cited them as examples of disciplined emotional response that the lattice's existing framework had been unable to accurately model, and which constituted new data that the revised framework was now built to incorporate. Dren read the amendment in the conference room. The translation interface was running because HFY was there, and someone had thought to get a copy of the amendment translated into HFY's language as well, which 3 months ago would have been impossible and was now merely difficult. He read it twice. He sat with it. Then he looked up and found the architect watching him. "You've had this in you for a while," he said. "The argument." "Yes," she said, "since before Orith Dane. The shape of it, yes. I did not have the evidence. And now you do. And now I do." She held his gaze. "You gave me the evidence." He thought about what to say to that. Thought about all the things that were true simultaneously. That he hadn't set out to give anyone evidence for anything. That he'd just done what he did. That the evidence was just what the doing looked like from the outside when someone was watching closely enough to see it clearly. That this was how most things that mattered actually worked. Not through intention, but through the accumulation of specific choices that added up to something legible. "You were watching the whole time," he said. "I was." She was quiet for a moment. 22 years in the lattice. I have worked with humans in joint operations on 14 occasions. I classified the pattern consistently, unpredictable with moderate positive outcomes. She paused. I was wrong about the unpredictability. You are not unpredictable. You are simply operating from a framework the lattice did not have parameters to read. Disciplined feeling, he said. Yes. We don't call it that. What do you call it? He thought about his grandmother and the neighbor and the fence line, his father and the colleague and the apartment move, his sister and the 12-year run of shifts that never ended without someone having someone beside them. He thought about Aaron in the dark saying, I heard you through the rock. 2 words. Still here. He thought about HFY touching the compression wrap on the shale of Orth Dane, checking if it was what it appeared to be. We don't really call it anything, he said. We just do it. We've been doing it long enough that we don't need a name for it anymore. The name would just slow it down. The architect looked at him for a long moment, the lattice quiet. Something older than the lattice in her expression. Something that had been there all along, underneath the framework. The thing the framework had been built to discipline rather than replace. The sovereignty word for it, she said slowly, is vel rath amin. It is an old word, pre-lattice. It means, approximately, the wisdom that lives in the hands before it reaches the mind. He sat with that. Vel rath amin, wisdom that lives in the hands before it reaches the mind. 300 years of institutional doctrine built to correct for it, amended now to incorporate it, because a human had run across a debris field and sat down on the ground and stood in the open and said, still here, and the universe had kept the receipt. He looked at HFY. The translation matrix had carried vel rath amin across the gap. HFY was looking at the display with the complete, focused attention that Dren now read as their version of deep recognition, the sensory organs fully forward, tracking. Then HFY said something, and the matrix carried it back. My people have this word also. We do not use it for wisdom. We use it for the thing that happens when a stranger sits down on the ground in front of you, and you realize that the world is larger than you believed, and safer, and that the size of it is not frightening but good. Nobody said anything for a while. The station hummed. The stars outside the window held their positions. The translation matrix kept its audio running, patient and accumulating, building its model of a language that hadn't existed in any registry 3 months ago, and now had 40 hours of conversation in it, and was growing. I have been thinking since I wrote this story about what it actually means to be underestimated. Not the military version, not the tactical version, not the version where you prove something to someone in a moment of crisis. The quieter version, the one that happens in the years before the crisis, in the months of being told you are supplementary, in the career of being classified as complementary, and not the thing keeping anyone alive. The version where you keep reading the documents nobody expects you to read. Keep learning the anatomy you're not required to know. Keep practicing the language at 70% fluency because 60 wasn't enough and you wanted enough. Dren didn't do any of that to prove something. That's what I keep coming back to. He did it because these were the people he worked with, and understanding them wasn't extra. It was the job. And I think that's the thing about humans that's hardest to put in a classification registry. It's not the moment of action, although the moment of action is real. It's the long, unwitnessed preparation that makes the moment possible. The years of quiet learning that nobody cataloged because it didn't look like capability until it was. The lattice classified humanity as unpredictable, with moderate positive outcomes. 3 years of reading the documents and learning the anatomy and practicing the language didn't register in that assessment. Because that kind of preparation doesn't announce itself. It just shows up in a debris field at 6 minutes 40 seconds and comes out the other side with someone who needed to hear, still here. You can't build a classification registry for that. You can only sit in a conference room with a translation matrix and an alien commander and a being from a system that nobody visited, and watch the gap between species get a little smaller because someone decided that understanding wasn't optional. That's not a tactic. That's not a doctrine. That's something older and quieter and harder to name. Vel rath amin, the wisdom that lives in the hands before it reaches the mind. If this story found you, and something in it stayed with you, the way these stories stay, share it with someone who needs reminding what humans are actually made of. That's not a small thing. That's how these stories find the people who need them. HFY. Soundscape exists because enough people decided that was worth doing. And every time you pass something like this along, you're doing the same thing Dren did on that ridge, showing up for someone without being asked.